we're talking about sin, right? Nice heavy light. Let's go heavy today, but I think in the end you'll realize it should lighten your heart when you see how God sees sin and actually what he did through his son. So this is a passage you may have heard before, even if you're very new to following Jesus. It's called the Lord's Prayer, and in it, it has a unique way of describing the relationship that comes about because of sin. It almost sounds like a financial obligation that's going on here. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. So what is this whole business about? Being indebted, other people owe you, and you have to make a choice. So sin and forgiveness is interwoven with almost like a financial obligation. To the Jewish mind, this would have made the most sense. So there are several different words used for sin in the Bible. I'm just going to run down about 5 of them. But this one used in Matthew, by Matthew, is the most common. And for the Jewish person, it would have made the most sense. You know this, that Matthew is basically appealing to a Jewish audience. If you've ever tried to start reading your New Testament and you realize, what's the big deal with so-and-so begot so-and-so, and why did this person have to come from this person, and all these kinds of things. But he knew that to the Jewish audience, this was very meaningful. So to a Jewish person, the idea that you could just say, forgive, forget, move on, it would have been like, no way, are you kidding me? You can't just do that. What happens is, when you've been sinned against, there's this debt that's owed, and what can you do about it? You and I, because we grow up in a culture that actually is post-Christian, we have ideas of like grace, second chances, and forgiveness. Even somebody who doesn't know Jesus in America today, if they've caught on to any cultural references, deep in our hearts we sort of say to ourselves, you know what, people deserve a second chance. And you ought to be able to be mature enough to forgive other people, right? Well, that's because we got that idea from Jesus himself. Our culture got it from Jesus himself, but we've forgotten that it came from him. And then actually some of us who are believers, to these folks, to say that you could just forgive people, if I owed you $50 and then you said, okay, listen, I'm going to forgive the debt. I need to know, how much did it cost you to do that? Well, it cost you about $50. It costs you something to forgive. This is very important when we think about what sin is, because it establishes our relationship with the God of the universe. Is we come before him as debtors. We owe this bill. And if you and I just in our American way say, oh, that's okay, forgive and forget and move on, it's no big deal, the Lord himself says, no, actually sin is a big deal. It is a big deal. It's not just something that I can flippantly. You have to be reminded that the forgiver, it costs him something. By the way, side note, this is why the sin of holding grudges against somebody else, it's most common amongst those of us who say we follow Jesus. There's a lot of things I could ask you to do, and you'd probably be willing to do it. But if I said, hey, somebody from your family years ago mistreated you, somebody said something to you years ago, when you start talking about people being able to forgive, all of a sudden it becomes very difficult. So I hope that as we talk about what sin is, I hope that you see that actually your next step in faith with Christ would be able to honestly go before God himself and say, I truly forgive everyone exactly like Jesus said in this passage. I'm going to take it literally, that I will forgive other people the way that the Lord himself has forgiven me. I owed a debt I could not pay, and Jesus himself paid it. Of course, also for the Jewish person, they would have known that this would have required, literally, you talk about the cost was not $50, the cost was the blood of something. So a wealthy person couldn't come up to his religious experience in this mindset and say, hey, here's a bunch of money, let's forgive and forget. Doesn't matter how much money. You can't buy off your sin. Something's going to have to die for your sin. Again, think about how this is a precursor for Jesus himself. The fact that you can't go before God and say, listen, I bring you money. I bring you my good deeds. Lord, do you know how awesome I am? Compared to most people on the planet, I'm a pretty good guy. The Lord looks at all of us, and it's all rubbish. It doesn't mean anything. Somebody's blood is going to have to be the payment. So these Jewish folks were used to hundreds of years of sacrifices being made. I commit a sin. I now owe God himself. So again, we have this concept in our minds of we'd say, well, it was a crime that had no victim, or this was just a private matter between me and God. But for these folks, they knew when you sin, you've actually, get this, tying together the financial concept, it's like you've stolen from God. The God of the universe deserved my utmost allegiance, my perfect obedience, no questions asked. But instead of giving him that, I gave him what I gave him. My errors, my mess-ups, my slip-ups, my sin. Every little sin in their minds was like, you owe God again. You owe him again. You owe him again. And they were caught in a vicious cycle of trying to offer up the blood of other animals, sheep, bulls, birds. The blood has to be spilt. Remember Cain and Abel from the very beginning. Cain and Abel, one offers the blood sacrifice, and one offers this fruit that he had grown in the garden. Well, the fruit, nobody dies for fruit. No matter how much fruit, millions of dollars of fruit, who cares? I'm not looking for a monetary thing. It's monetary, but it's beyond that. It's going to have to involve the blood of something. So this idea of indebtedness and how do you pay off that kind of a debt? And then again, think about how interesting it is that when Jesus chooses this passage, he uses debts, again, like a financial word. So what are some of the words that we hear for sin? Just quickly, I'll run these down. Harmatia, you've probably heard this before. By the way, all of these are correct, but they don't always capture the full essence of what Jesus meant by sin when talking to these people in Matthew. Harmatia, it's a sports term. It means to miss the mark. You've probably heard that before. If you think about that, you think, well, I can almost live with that because let's say I'm doing archery. I didn't hit the bullseye every time, but I'm doing pretty good. But of course, even under that criteria, if we're really honest with ourselves, if you was to say to me, hey, I'm pretty much hitting the mark, or if I was to say to you, I'm pretty much hitting the mark, and then you were to maybe challenge me a little deeper and say, hey, Robert, you mean with a perfect heart and a perfect mind every time you're hitting a bullseye? Seriously? Really? And the truth is, no. So by that definition of sin, I'm missing the mark. Hermetesis, it means when you cross the line. It can almost mean like there's this gray area. You got near the line, and then you happen to trip over. Okay? Again, that doesn't feel as weighty as having this huge debt that I can't pay, only be paid by blood. Anomos, breaking the law. This is a flagrant rebellion. The previous one was you were in a gray zone and things got fuzzy. Under anomos, you broke the law. This would be like a legal term. You know, it's black and white. You either did or you did not. You're either pregnant or you are not pregnant. Which one is it? There's no like halfway in between. When you break a law like this, then again, once again, it's a very personal thing. You broke a law, but on the personal factor, it was God himself who had given you that law. So in essence, you slapped him in the face. Peritome is what Luke uses. It means to slip or fall. And this could be, it gets translated often in Old English as trespass. So you've probably, if you read through your Bible a lot, especially in certain versions, you hear this word trespass. You know, those who trespass against you and you trespassing. Again, when I think of trespass, I think of, well, I might have just kind of lost my bearings. I didn't know that I had crossed into the property line of somebody else. Under the definition, you're right. Legally, I'm dead to rights. I'm in the wrong spot. But I could almost fall into there almost accidentally, right? So trespassing, sometimes it's intentional, but oftentimes it could just be, I was wandering, I lost my way. So the connotations with trespassing as a sin would be basically through lack of self-control, I slipped. It just happened. So at worst, maybe there's a little bit of guilt on my part because I wasn't self-controlled enough. So for example, I know I have a problem with gambling, and I went right to you-know-where down I-4 where they have this huge gambling establishment, and I know that I have a pattern of not being able to drive by there because of how I'm wired, So most people would view it as, well, that poor slob Robert, he got too close, and then because of carelessness, he fell into sin. But it's not quite as convicting as, you blatantly went out and were because this is not a premeditated sin. And then ophilema, owing a debt, disobeying God himself. And this is the most all-inclusive term, and this is what Matthew is talking about here, translated as a Greek word. By the way, the other challenge, of course, is that we have a Bible that's written in Hebrew. Jesus most often spoke Aramaic, common language of his day, and yet it's written in Greek. So when the question is asked, which translation, it's, how many languages are you willing to accommodate for? But that actually is what makes the Bible so vibrant and alive and so honest, is because you have multiple cultures, multiple languages, they're all coming together. All of those words are the correct words for sin. But again, for Matthew, for you and I, the most all-inclusive term, this is on the Sermon on the Mount, this is in the Lord's Prayer, this ophilema, it means to disobey, to steal from God his due, like I mentioned before. So that carries the full weight of what we talk about when we say sin in this sense. When you and I approach one another and we have a hard time forgiving one another, it is because genuinely, you should just be honest, it's because forgiving someone isn't as flippant as saying, hey, that's okay, no harm, no foul, we move on. If you've ever really been offended, if you've ever really been sinned against, it does hurt. There can be a sting, and that can run the gamut from big things, little things, and everything in between. When you ask someone to forgive, when you ask yourself to forgive, you should just be honest and go, you know what? It does cost something. The truth is, if it doesn't cost me something to forgive something that you've done against me, you probably did something that I just pretty much could care less one way or the other, It'd be like you come over and you apologize because your dog walked on my lawn. And I'm like, well, I really don't care. It's no big deal. But when you genuinely offend me, for me to forgive you, it costs something. So again, Matthew is setting us up. Jesus, through his words, through his prayer, is setting us up. He's saying it costs. So when you hear the word sin, if you take nothing else away from this Theology Thursday, when you hear the word sin, you should think, somebody owes somebody, right? And the beautiful part about the gospel is we have the rest of the story. We have the one who can pay that price, Jesus himself. Nothing short of a blood sacrifice would do. Nothing short of a perfect being sacrificed would do. He was able to pay that price. So he was able to, in one fell swoop, cover the sins of the world for those who actually believe he did what he said he did. So I encourage you, your action steps might be to rethink your forgiveness towards others. Do you hold it like a debt? Like they owe you money and you're keen to sort of constantly make them pay for it? Or when you understand forgiveness, are you like, you know what, it costs me, but I'm going to give it up. Why will I give it up? Because I have a master and a savior who did the same for me. That's the only reason why I can forgive at this level. I hope you're able to embrace forgiveness. I hope you're able to embrace what a huge debt's been paid for you. And I hope when you hear the word sin, you're actually reminded of what a great loving God you have, because he had to take care of all